Okay, well, we're going to be looking at the what's often referred to as the parable of the workers or the labourers in the vineyard. This is recorded in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. So we'll read through this passage here. This is Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16, and we'll be looking at the context in a little while, but we'll read through the parable here. For the kingdom of heaven, of the heavens, is like the owner of a house who went out early in the morning to hire workers for their vineyard. He agreed with the workers a denarius for a day's work and sent them into the vineyard. And going out at the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. To them he said, "You too go into the vineyard, and I will give you what is fair." So they went. Again he went out about the sixth and ninth hour and did the same. About the 11th hour he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, "Why are you standing idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the Lord of the vineyard said to the manager, "Call to the workers and give them their wages, starting with the last until the first." And when those from the 11th hour came, they each received a denarius. And those who were first thought that they would receive more, and they each also received a denarius. And receiving it, they grumbled against the house owner, saying, "These last ones did 1 hour's work, and you have made them equal to those who bore the burden of the day and of the burning sun." But he answered to one of them, "Colleague, I have done you no wrong. Surely you agreed 1 denarius with me. Take what is yours and go. I want to give to this last person the same as you. Aren't I permitted to do what I want with what is mine? Or is your eye evil because I am good?" Thus the last will be first, and the first last. The parable of the workers or the labourers in the vineyard is one which is found only in the Gospel of Matthew. And it might be seen as Matthew's equivalent to the parable of the prodigal son, which we looked at last week, since there are certain similarities between the two. It is, though, an odd and a troubling parable, since it seems to go against our expectations of fairness when all of the workers are paid the same wage regardless of how long they worked during the day. This is not our experience of employers and of working practices. Considering the context of the parable, though, Matthew places it at the end of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, but at a time before Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem for the final week. So chapter 19, verse 1 begins when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. So Jesus is on the move now, moving from Galilee in the north, making his journey south through Judea, where he'll eventually end up in Jerusalem. And chapter 20, verse 17, the verse following our reading, says, while Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. So he's on his way there. And then chapter 21, verse 1 has his entry into Jerusalem when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives. So this parable is set in that time towards the end of Jesus' ministry on this earth, but it's before the final week. The immediate context of the parable is to be seen from chapter 19, verses 16 to 30. In chapter 19, from verse 16 to verse 22, we have Jesus' conversation with the rich young man who wanted to know what good deed he needed to do to have eternal life. When Jesus told him to keep the commandments, he asked which ones. When Jesus identified the commandments, he said that he had kept all of these, so what else did he lack? Jesus then told him to sell his possessions and give the money to the poor and follow him, and then he would have treasure in heaven. But on hearing this, the young man went away sorrowful, because he was rich, he had many possessions, and he was unable to do what Jesus was asking of him. Then in verses 23 to 26, Jesus, following the departure of the rich young man, Jesus then told his disciples how difficult it would be for the rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And when the disciples heard this, they were astounded, and they asked him, "Then who can be saved?" Their assumption was that if you were rich, then salvation would not be difficult for you. A person's wealth would have been taken as a sign of God's blessing upon them. God was blessing them, and therefore salvation was almost guaranteed for them. Jesus acknowledged that although it may be difficult for the rich to enter the kingdom, he says, for God, all things are possible. And then in chapter 19, verses 27 to 30, Peter then asked Jesus this question: "Look, we have left everything and followed you. What then shall we have?" So what reward could Peter and the other disciples expect for giving up everything in order to follow Jesus? Jesus answered by giving assurance that they would be sitting on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, whatever that may have meant. Those who have left their families and property for Jesus' sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. So Jesus is assuring them that they're not going to miss out on anything. And he concluded by saying, "But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first." So the natural order of things as experienced and lived in the world will be reversed in the kingdom of heaven. And so it is against the background of this discussion that Matthew then records this parable of the workers in the vineyard, introducing it with the statement in chapter 20, verse 1, "For the kingdom of heaven is like." And we've come across that or similar statements to that in our studies of some of the earlier parables. So Jesus is about to draw this comparison between the kingdom of heaven and this process of the hiring and the paying of laborers to work in a vineyard. So Jesus is going to show there's some sort of similarity between living in the kingdom or coming into the kingdom and what is described here in this process of hiring laborers. So we come to look at the details of the parable then, and in this parable Jesus is describing a realistic situation involving two familiar locations. There's a public marketplace and there's a vineyard, places that people would have been familiar with. Jesus says in verse 1, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard." The word translated as landowner or householder here is the Greek word oikodespotes, which literally means master of the house. So identifying the one who owns the house or the land or the property. This word is used 13 times in the New Testament, and it's only found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and it's often used by Jesus in his parables. So there are other parables that Jesus teaches which feature a character who is a landowner or a householder. In this parable, the landowner seems to be fairly well-to-do. He owns a vineyard and he can afford to hire laborers to go and work in it for him. So the man goes out early in the morning to hire some workers or laborers to work in his vineyard. We're not told in the parable why he needs these laborers, but extra labor would be something that would be needed during the time of the grape harvest. And so perhaps this is his reason for hiring these laborers. The grape harvest would take place from the end of August to early September, before the rains came in late September. And so there was an urgency about this, that the crop needed to be gathered in quickly. And so every available worker would be called upon to help. The labourers that the landowner is looking to hire are day labourers. The word translated as labourer here is ergates, and this would be the cheapest form of labour to employ. They would be people who would be employed on a daily basis when work was available, similar to those who work on these 0 hours contracts in our time. So these labourers would really be the poorest members of society. Even slaves would be better off than them, since although a slave doesn't have his or her freedom, they are looked after by their masters. They're fed and they're housed. But these day labourers have a precarious existence with no guarantee of regular daily work or income. And for this reason, the law of Moses required that they should be given their pay at the end of the day when they had worked. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 13 says, "You shall not keep for yourself the wages of a labourer until morning." You can't hold over his pay until the next day. Pay him at the end of the day. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 14 and 15 also says, "You shall not withhold the wages of poor and needy labourers, whether other Israelites or aliens who reside in your land in one of your towns. You shall pay them their wages daily before sunset, because they are poor and their livelihood depends on them. Otherwise they might cry to the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt." So they would need that money at the end of the day to feed themselves and their families. If they weren't paid, then they wouldn't be able to eat. So very precarious existence for those who were day labourers. So the landowner has gone out early in the morning then to look for these workers who he wants to hire. The workers would gather in the marketplace from early morning, waiting for someone to come along who needed workers for that day, who would hire them. You may see something similar today. I know I've seen in passing a B&Q store, the DIY store, people hanging around outside of the shop, waiting for someone to employ them, to hire them for the day to do some DIY work. So the marketplace here was the place where these labourers would gather. It'd be a bit like the job centre or the labour exchange. In those days, there would be no way to accurately tell the time. It would be done really by the position of the sun, and the working day was from sunrise to sunset, roughly by our timing around 6 o'clock in the morning till 6 in the evening. So in the parable, the times at which the labourers are hired are given as early in the morning, and then again about the third hour, which some versions convert into our equivalent of about 9 o'clock in the morning, and then again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, which are converted to noon, so midday, and then about 3 o'clock in the afternoon is the equivalent of the 9th hour, and then finally about the 11th hour, which is 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then at the end of the working day, when evening came, so around 6 o'clock in the evening, then the labourers are paid. So he's in the marketplace and he has a group of workers there. And verse 2 says, "After agreeing with the labourers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard." The usual daily wage for a labourer was a denarius. And that's how the word that is used in the text there. The Revised Standard Version and the New International Version use that word in the text, that they are hired for a denarius. That's the standard going rate for a day's work for a labourer. So the householder has made this agreement with this first group of workers who he's hired at the start of the day, early in the morning, that they would be paid the going rate of 1 denarius for one day's work. And so with that agreement in place, they set off to work in the vineyard. Later on, about the third hour or 9 o'clock in the morning, the householder went out again to the marketplace and he found some other workers who were standing there idle. And he told them, "You go into the vineyard and I will pay you whatever is right." So this time there's no formal agreement about what they will be paid, but rather he promises that they will be paid whatever is right. So you will be fairly paid for your work. So the workers accepted this on this understanding, and they too went off to work in the vineyard. Same thing happens again about the 6th hour or noon, midday, and then at the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So more groups of men are hired at these times. It might be that the householder realizes the work is not going to get finished today unless he finds some more laborers. And so we have this continuous toing and froing from the marketplace to hire the laborers. And then at about the 11th hour, 5 o'clock, with just 1 hour of the working day remaining, he went out again and found another group still waiting in the marketplace. And he asked them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" And they answer, "Because no one has hired us." They're not standing there because they're lazy and don't want to work. It was just that no one had hired them. They were willing to work. And it says something about their desperation that they are prepared to continue waiting for the remote possibility that perhaps someone might hire them, even so close to the end of the day. So even if there is only 1 hour of the day left, the householder still needed some more laborers, and so he sent this group to work in the vineyard as well. And then at the end of the day, when evening came, the vineyard owner instructed his manager to pay the laborers. Verse 8 says, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." They're to be paid in the order of those who were hired last. They would be the first to be paid. When the group who were hired at the 11th hour came forward, they, perhaps to their surprise, were paid 1 denarius. They were paid for a full day's work, the daily rate, even though they've only worked for 1 hour. So this goes through the whole process, and when it came to the turn of the first group hired early in the morning to be paid, they're now expecting to receive something more than 1 denarius. They've seen what's gone on here. They've seen that those who work less than them have all been paid 1 denarius. And so surely it's not unreasonable for them to expect something more than this. However, when it comes to their turn to be paid, they too received 1 denarius. Everyone gets the same. And what they saw here as unfair treatment then led to grumbling and complaining. And so they went to the owner and they complained. They say, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." Comparing the two groups, we might have some sympathy, for this is perhaps how we might react if we had been treated in that way. One group worked the last hour of the day, the other group worked 12 hours through the heat of the day, and yet both groups are paid the same. It hardly seems fair. So perhaps a call to the local union rep might be appropriate here. But listen to the owner's response to this in verses 13 to 15. He says, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I gave to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So he's explaining to them that their grievance is unfounded. At the start of the day, the first group had made an agreement with the owner that they would be paid 1 denarius for their labor. And the owner has honored that agreement. And what the owner then chooses to pay the other groups is really none of their business. So if he chooses to pay them all the same, then that's up to him. It's his money. He can do with it as he chooses. So the first group to be hired have not been treated unfairly. They only see it as being unfair because they are comparing themselves with the others. And by their rules of comparison, it is unfair. So the owner ends by asking them, are you envious because I am generous? Or a Revised Standard Version, do you begrudge my generosity? The Authorized Version has, is your eye evil because I am good? And then Jesus concludes, so the last will be first and the first last. And that was how the passage had begun. At the last verse of chapter 19, Jesus had said, but many that are first will be last, and the last first. And then we had the parable and then the conclusion, so the last will be first, and the first last. So that saying, that statement, sort of bookends the whole passage here. So what are we to make of this parable? The parable has been interpreted by some allegorically as an allegory. Irenaeus, who lived in the 2nd century AD, followed this interpretation, and he identified the laborers as those whom God has called at different times. So the first group of workers who are hired early in the morning, they represent those that God had called at the creation of the world, so the patriarchs like Noah and Abraham and so on. And then the second group hired at the 3rd hour, he said, are those whom God had called under the old covenant, so Moses and Israel. And then the third group hired at the 6th hour were those who were called during the ministry of Jesus, during his lifetime. The fourth group hired at the 9th hour are those who were called during Irenaeus's own time, so 2nd century and that around that period. And then the fifth group, the last group hired at the 11th hour, are those who are called at the end of time. But really, this is to miss the point of the parable, to interpret as an allegory in this way. It's sort of taking it out of its original context, really, to do it this way. But that was a popular way of interpreting the parables at the time. Another view is to see the owner's treatment of the workers as an illustration of the generosity of God towards sinners, regardless of when people come to him for salvation. And this is really more in line with what I think the parable is about. That those who come to God early in life and offer him a lifetime of service receive the same salvation as those who come late in life and do not perhaps serve him as long. And this is how the grace of God and the goodness of God operates, that salvation is the same for everyone. And those who think that they deserve something more because they've served longer than others have not really understood the grace of God or the nature of service. In effect, the parable has answered Peter's earlier question, we have left everything and followed you. What then shall we have? The expectation that there's some greater reward for longer service. It also shows us how those who perhaps think of themselves as being first may actually be regarded by God as last. The parable also teaches us the lesson that the rules of the kingdom of God may seem incomprehensible to us. We may disagree about who is welcome in the kingdom. We may wonder why some are included. We may think that others are undeserving. Well, why is this person here when, I do far more than them, or comparing ourselves with one another? But what the parable is teaching us is that it is not for us to question the generosity or the goodness of God. Paula Gooder, in her book on the parables, says this about it. We are not invited to sit down and discuss whether they, whoever they are, should be in the kingdom at all, just as the landowner can make his own rules, which he negotiated with each worker in turn, so the rules of the kingdom invite each one of us in, but do not ask for our judgment on who else should be welcome and why. The landowner had his own rules, which he applied justly in each case, even though this seemed unfair to others. In the same way, we cannot hope to wrap our minds around the rules of the kingdom. We simply have to trust that the kingdom's rules will be just and generous to others as well as to us. So the parable is really a lesson for us on the generosity of God, the goodness of God, that God has a right to be generous to whomever he chooses. And then it's not for us to question that. We simply must appreciate the generosity of God that we have experienced for ourselves. So we will stop here and invite any comments.